Hello, everybody. Christian Bradley for the Game Institute, and we are back in Max today. We're going to be talking about shaders, maybe, if I can prove this is actually live right now. Okay, yeah, it looks like it is. So we're going to be back in shaders, and if my sound's a little goofy, I hope it isn't, it's because I just smashed a muffin into my microphone. You know, when you sit here all day long and you have a headset on with a microphone, you tend to forget the headset's on. So I can't tell you how many headsets I've wrecked by getting out of my chair, walking away, and snapping the cord because the headset's still on my head. Or how many microphones I've wrecked by smashing something into them because I forgot they were there. Oh well. So, Max. Yeah. We're going to be talking about the shaders. So a little bit about shaders while I get set up here. I'm going to make a few spheres. Uh, the shaders in Max are, for the most part, procedural. Which means they're generated in the program, if you've heard that word thrown around and like me for a lot of years, just kind of nodded and pretend you knew what it meant. It means that they're generated programmatically. That's not a word. They're generated by the program, procedurally generated. Math flying around, patterns being smashed together, all that stuff. And they used to only live in that program. So if you took a Max file and opened it in another version of Max, it would probably open with your shaders intact, at least if you've been using Max in the last 10 years or so. But if you make a shader, say in Maya, and move it over to Max, well, the chances of that shader coming over intact with all of its attributes are pretty much slim to none. And long ago, I'm guessing it was about 10, 12 years ago, uh, whatever Max version came out at that point, came out with the ability to bake textures out. Now, these days we kind of take that for granted. That's just part of our pipeline process to get assets into a game engine. But it didn't used to be there. And so now you can bake procedural textures out. Now, if you want those procedural textures to be rebuilt in another program, then you're going to have to do a lot of baking to get them out. And you'd really have to want to get those textures out. I would say that going over to Quixel or Substance or some other program is probably the quicker route than making your procedurals here at Max and baking them out. Also, baking them out is only going to get you the maps. So then you have to recombine those maps over in whatever program you're going off to and figure out the settings for those maps to look correct. So if you've got like a shiny metal, you can't just render the diffuse map and get shiny metal. It's just not going to work. There's a lot more attributes to metal than just a color map. But it is a good trick, and there are reasons we like to do this. Mainly, I like to make procedurals on my models for, what would you call it? Kind of large scale pattern type maps. So think of cheetah spots, for instance. I could very easily go Google cheetah spots and then map those to my model. That's the normal way. I could paint them on. That's certainly a way. Or I could make a procedural map of, say, cheetah spots, wrap it onto my model or map it onto my model, and then bake that out, and then get over to Photoshop and deal with the different maps and combine them. That's usually what I do with them. So what we're going to do today is just play with the material editor. So the material editor is this thing up here. It looks like a big checker ball. And or you can just hit M on your keyboard. And it's going to show up looking like this. Maybe, there we go. It's going to look like that when you open it. That's the Slate editor. Now this showed up a few versions of Macs ago. I know how to use the Slate editor, but I'm not very good at it, and I can't really get my textures to look good in it. When it comes to the particle effects and the different places this kind of non-linear editor shows up in Macs, I can deal with it. But the textures, I've not dealt with it much. And the truth is, the compact material editor, or the older material editor, gets me everything I need for game stuff. I don't know a lot of people using the Slate editor that do video games. They usually use this editor, but you can if you want to put the time into it. And maybe it looks a little bit more like what you're used to if you're coming from Maya or some other program, UDK, something like that. But we're going to use the compact one here. And each of these is a shader, these little spheres here. You can see they go down here a ways. All these settings along this side are basically to manipulate your views. Here, I'm just going to leave them as these spheres for the time being. And all these buttons down here are used to do something with the shader in the viewport. So these guys here tend to affect what your shader looks like so you can view it. These guys down here tend to affect what your shader looks like in your viewport without going into all of the commands there. Also, if you want, you can double click on a shader and it will open up. You can rotate the shader around here if you would like. For some reason, it really taxes my computer here at home when I do that, so I don't know if we'll do that too much. I've kind of gotten away from it, but those shaders are kind of small to see what you're doing. All right, next we'll go down here and take a look. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory, and we just want to get to the fun stuff. So these guys here are, again, just to do something to the shader over here in your viewport or on the mesh. Here's your ambient color, your diffuse color, and specular color. We'll come back to those in just a second. You'll see the ambient and the diffuse are locked. That's because we're in blend mode. And you get some other modes here, which we may or may not get to in this video. But you can see if I go to something like metal, these change along with all your map types change. So you can think of this as kind of the master control. Anisotropic is one that I use quite often. It makes pretty good metals because of the way the specularity works, but the default is blend. So, but just keep in mind, as soon as you change these, everything that's on my screen is going to change. It makes teaching this kind of hard because that little master control changes all the interface. Self-illumination is here. If we bump that up, I don't want to check color, but if we bump that way up, you'll see that we get no shadows, meaning it's totally luminous. That's a common question I get. It's not the same as a glow. A glow creates a halo effect. That's a post-process in Macs. This just makes the surface luminous. So that one we use quite a bit, but it's in a weird spot, I think. It's up here. You'd think it would be down here, but it's up here. And here's your opacity. So right now it's at 100%, but you can see if I move this up and down, well, it becomes more see-through. And if you want to see the background on that, you can click that little checker map, and you'll see that checker is showing through. That's what that little button there is for. Also, whatever shader you're working on is the one with the white frame. So if I click on a shader, it'll have that white frame. All this stuff down here belongs to that shader and any instances of that shader. So you got to keep an eye on which one has the white frame. And I know in the videos that gets a little confusing because I'll click up here and then I'm working down here, but you don't know what's going on up here because you don't know which one I'm working on. It's the one with the white frame. While we're on that, if I drag my shader over to this sphere, now that sphere is gray. Let's make it a different color so we can see it's a different color. Now it's pink. The little tabs in the corner there mean that it is on it's on something in the scene. And if the little tabs are white, it's on the selected thing. So if I click over here, you'll see those little tabs turned gray. They got a white outline, but they're gray. Where if I select on it, the little tabs will turn white, and that means that this material, pink material, is in the scene because it has tabs. These are not in the scenes. They're just sitting there doing nothing right now. And because those tabs are white, it is on the selected material. That doesn't mean that I'm working on the selected material. See, the white frame is over here. I'm working on this one. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but they got to have some way of directing all these materials, and that's how they do it. All right, down here at the bottom, this is your specular level. This is pretty easy to understand. If we bump these two controls up here, it controls this little bell curve, and that's your highlight. The easiest way to explain it is the higher it is, the brighter it is, or stronger, I guess we should say. And the narrower the base, the tighter the highlight. And basically this is supposed to represent how much light is bouncing from that area there. So that area right there, that base, that's how wide it is. And the height is how bright it is. You can see it changing up here. So there you go. Soften I don't use much, but you can play with that if you want. It just blends between the base and where the base blends out over the surface. All right, we're going to skip a few of these tabs because they're not really going to apply to us today. Extended parameters and super sampling we're going to skip. And mental ray, we're not going to deal with mental ray because, boy, that's a lifetime of videos right there. So I'm not going to deal with those today. I'm just going to go to maps. And this is usually where I'm at. Students just get lost because it's folded up here. And when you unfold it, this interface looks very different. You can see that you kind of have to scroll down to get to the maps. Again, these are the Blinn map types. So if you want different map types, you have to change that guy. Okay, going down a little bit further. Well, map types are pretty self-explanatory. There's a few weird ones like filter color in here. But the ones that we really care about are diffuse color, which you'll see is locked to ambient color. And that's because long ago, diffuse color and ambient color were two different maps. If you go far enough back, we used to actually call color maps ambient maps. Then they got called diffuse maps. Well, now they're called albedo maps. They're basically all the same thing, sort of, mostly. But they're locked here because both of them effectively do the same thing. And I would just leave them locked for our game development purposes. Specular color is the color of the highlight or the color of the light being reflected back. Don't use that one too much. Specular level, now that's going to be the map that's going to control the specular highlight. Glossiness, well, we deal with that quite a bit, so that one should make sense. Self-illumination is the map that controls what parts of the model glow. So if you just want tail lights glowing, your map would just have that part painted white. All the rest of the map would be black and your tail lights would glow. Opacity is which parts are invisible or translucent, I should say, transparent, translucent. And so if you've got a butterfly with translucent wings, it's probably not the best example. You've got a dragonfly with translucent parts of the wing, but it's all one map. You would have the translucent parts be white to dark gray, depending on how much translucency there is on them. And the rest of the map would be black, and that would make the wings see-through. That was a long explanation. Filter color, I mentioned, don't use it too much. Bump is where we're going to put our normal map, and we'll take a look at that in a second. Reflection, refraction, these two do take some processing power. I use reflection quite a bit. Refraction is the bending of light that you would expect to see in volume. So if this was a solid glass ball, it would certainly reflect. That would be that surface reflection. But refraction would be the bending of light as we see through it. Refraction tends to take a lot of processing when you render it. And displacement, well, we've used a lot of displacement before. We're not going to do that today, but it's another one I tend to use for landscapes and so forth. So let's take a look at diffuse color. Now I'm going to go back to my little pink sphere here. And we'll go to its maps. And I'm going to go to diffuse color. And now we're not going to use bitmaps. We've done that a lot in the past. So we're only going to use procedurals, which we've not really done at all. And everything below bitmap isn't necessarily a procedural texture, but most are. And the easy way to at least kind of bracket which ones we care about when we're beginning are any of them with the little picture here. You can see like dent, checker, cellular, gradient ramp, noise. There's some others down here. Smoke. And some of the little pictures are dark and some are gray, but any of them with a little picture will work for our needs today. For some reason, marble and Perlin marble are in color, and I never really figured out why, but splat's in color too, twirl. Anyway, so ones with the little pictures are mostly procedural. And like I said, not all these are procedurals, and that's because there's some in here like color correction, camera map per pixel. There's a few others. There's like thin wall refraction. Those are rendering shaders that have come in from, for the most part, other Autodesk programs that do something very specific. And if we don't have anything in our scene that's specifically tied to them, they just do nothing. So practicing and playing with them is just going to waste time. So we'll stick with some of the more basic ones. If it sounds like it describes something, that's probably a good way to do it. Marbles, obvious, noise, those. So I'm going to go ahead and click noise for mine. You don't have to hit OK. You can just double click on it. And then it's going to go to what looks like it's not pink anymore, but see over here it didn't change, and that's because we now have a layer beneath our default. So if I was to change this to, we'll just call it pink surface. You could just rename those. So that one's called pink surface, but I go back into my diffuse color to where it says noise. I'm going to name this yellow and something different. How about blue? I'm going to name it yellow and blue. So if I look at this, I've got pink surface and then yellow and blue. Now right now it's not yellow and blue. So let's change it to yellow. I'm going to click these two color swatches here. Yellow, yellow, and blue. There you go. And it's going to change my noise to a yellow and blue. And it's applied to this surface, or this shade, or surface, shader is applied to the surface, because I've got those little white tabs. It says it is. But there's nothing there. Now if I was to render this, you'll see that it is there. So what's up? Well, that's where the viewport gets a little bit funky, and there are ways to make this work. We'll look at them. But by default, the viewport just renders the topmost layer or attribute of your shader, which is pink. But I've put a noise pattern of blue and yellow on it, which is what it's rendering as. That's actually what it looks like. Now we can see that a couple ways. We can either hit this little show shaded material in viewport, and you'll see it doesn't look at all like what we'd expect it to. Like that's not that. That's way off. Well, that's just a Max thing. It's this button here is kind of an older button that works for bitmap textures really well. Not so much for procedural. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. That's why I picked noise, because I knew noise wasn't going to work with it. Or we can come over here to realistic, where it says realistic, right click, had to look at the mouse, go down under materials and then say realistic materials with maps, and it'll come on. It'll look like a checker map for a second, and there we go. And you'll see every time I hit it, it's going to re-render it. Now the reason we don't want that on all the time is what you just saw. It's that little checker pattern that pops on. It just takes it a while to render it. And I actually leave it on all the time. But if your machine isn't that great, or you end up with a lot of procedurals in your scene, you may not want it flickering that checker pattern all the time every time you move the scene. Um, I'm usually working on pretty simple game assets, so it's usually not a problem. So I usually leave that viewport view on. And if you go to other viewports, you need to turn it on in other viewports. I'm going to stay here in perspective for now. Now every time we change a color, for instance, we'll change one to green, it's going to change what that part of the map is. Oh, that wasn't a very obvious one. Let's do red. Okay. So now I'm going to change the blue to, oh wait, we got this labeled. So let's go to, what was it? Yellow and blue, because we had it labeled. So let's go back to yellow and blue. There we go. Let's talk about the things that you want to do to manipulate this. The first thing you want to do is look around for something that sounds like a size or a scale. And they're all going to be different. So every procedural's little interface here looks different. Chances are it was written by a different person is one of the reasons. And so here's size. That one's easy. So I'll lower the size of this. And as I lower the size, you'll see that that noise pattern starts to get smaller. And that's important to understand, is that something as simple as a noise pattern can be clouds in the sky, or it can be gravel on the ground. As long as you change the scale, you could do a lot of things with it. I could stretch this out on one axis and get wood grain, for instance. I can make it gray and dark gray and get cement. So you can make a lot of different surfaces using it. So always look for the size first. I'm going to scale this down a little bit so we have something more interesting to look at. There we go. That should work. The noise type usually shows up in these procedurals, and you can change them. So there's something like fractal, which is just going to change the math behind the scene here to make a different noise pattern. That's the best I could describe it. I'm sure a programmer would correct me, but you'll see fractal is a little bit bumpier, a little bit more meatier. And then there's this turbulence setting, and turbulence tends to be more like you threw these two colors in a blender. And there you go. And you'll see little spots of them showing up, which probably doesn't show up on the video at all because they're really small, but you can try it. I'm going to go back to regular for that. All right, so once you get your size set up, well, then you have to decide what you want to do with this. So for instance, I can go back to my top, what is pink surface. Now it's not pink anymore at all. So we can just change this to top surface. It's not pink anymore. And I could go to, say, bump, and I could add this same material to my bump. I'm going to render this close up here so we can see it. Okay, there's our material right now. And if I go to bump, well, I could set up the same material. I could save this material. I could load it. But I could also just drag this material down to bump. And it's going to ask if I want to copy or an instance or swap. Swap just replaces it. A copy means that I'm making a copy and placing it in this slot, and anything now that I change in this slot will not affect that slot. An instance means anything I change in this slot or this slot will affect both equally. So I'm going to make an instance. You'll see why. Then go down here, and I'm going to change one of these to black and one of these to white. And what it's going to do is now make a bumpy surface, and it'll render. Like I said, it starts to take a while to render these. And come on. There we go. And now if I click over here, now we've got a bumpier surface. It's not showing up because I don't have any specular on it. See, no specular. So I'm going to add some specular. And if I make that specular kind of tight, you'll see now that if I was to add a light, I don't think I have a light in this scene. That would be a good idea. I'm going to add an omni light here. There we go. Now, if I move that around, you'll see that that checker ball is kind of annoying. see it move around on the surface. You can see it kind of jumping around those bumps. And by the way, that re-rendering only happens when I move the viewport or the object. It takes a long time to render it because now the lights will affect it. It's not going to re-render when I move the lights, usually. It sometimes does, but usually not, as long as you got enough processing power, RAM. Okay, so now, if I render this though, I betcha it's going to be, oh, it's great. Oh, I made it an instance, that's why. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm going to take, let's say we want the color back in that. So I take none, replace it here, and now take this one, put it back in my diffuse color. I'm going to make this one a copy this time, and we'll change this to blue and yellow. And now I'll end up with blue and yellow on my bumpy ball because the grayscale bump map is, whoops, wrong way. The grayscale bump map is down here where the color is up here. And you can see once you start moving around, you got to rename them. It's not a big deal. Usually I don't change the names of those things. All right, let's go to glossiness this time. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to drop, oh, that's actually the other one. We're going to drop this grayscale into glossiness. And I'm going to make a copy this time. And we're going to jump over to glossiness here. And once it renders, it should look a little bit different. There we go. And let's see what that looks like. And now it's going to have a glossier highlight to it, but not everywhere. Only where the white is, because the black is not glossy. So you're going to get different settings for this. Let's go over to the next one here. I'm going to select a new shader for this one. And let's use something different in our diffuse. So instead of that one, what did we use last time? We used noise. Let's use cellular, which is probably my favorite one. I'm going to drag it over here. And let's see what we've got here. So cellular is in our diffuse. And I'm looking for a size on this. Okay. So I'm looking for size is what I'm trying to find. And we're going to make that a little bit bigger this time. There we go. See what we got. You can see that's probably too big. When you're dealing with scale, it depends on what size object you're working with and all sorts of stuff. A little bit smaller. There we go. So now if I render it, that looks good. Okay. I'm going to replace this material with a gray just so we can see what's going on with this one. Alright, I'm going to make my cellular colors just really obvious and ugly here. So we'll do like a red, a green, and how about a bright blue. That should look horrible. There we go. Okay, and I'm not seeing in my viewport. Let me go on, double check over here. Go to materials. There we go. Sometimes you have to reset that. It doesn't always kick in. You can see the size is probably way too small right now, so I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. There we go. That one's not updating very well. See, that's what it's supposed to look like. It's not updating at all right there. Alright, so we did find the size, so we were able to do that. Let's look at the different ones to choose from. There's chips, which kind of looks like broken ceramic. I don't usually use chips for much. And then we can put fractal on it, which is going to change the way that that is rendered. So that's a fractal noise pattern underneath the chips pattern, which is giving me kind of a cool looking thing. Let's say I want the green to be red and the red to be green, more like lava. So we can just swap them here. That's looking pretty good. And let's make the green into, say, a brown, like actually more like a real dark brown. And you'll see kind of what I'm starting to make. So now we'll make like a lava. So the red is going to be a bright orange. Right about there. And the blue will make a super red. So now we've kind of got this lava effect going on. I want a little bit more spread, I think, on that. Yeah. So what that's doing is changing the way that pattern is applied. And now let's make part of that glow. So if we go from dragging this one down to self-illumination, and in this case I want it to be a copy. There we go. And this is rendering all wrong, so I'll keep rendering this. And right now, whatever is white will glow and whatever is dark won't. So this one I want to be black. And this one I want to be almost white. We'll go with a gray, like a bright gray. And this one's going to be white. And now I've got the lava glowing, but the brown is going to stay dull, kind of like cracked earth or lava. It's not my best cracked earth or lava, but you get the idea. So there's some other settings here. The thresholds are fun to play with. I'm not going to do that now, but what it'll do is tighten things up, and if I was probably making lava, I would dive into the thresholds at this point. All right, let's jump over to our last little sphere here, and we'll just grab this one and throw that on there. And this one will go to our maps. We'll start with diffuse, and this time let's go to something a little bit different. How about wood? So there's our wood pattern, and the wood pattern by default is pretty ugly. You'll see I don't like it. I'm going to grain thickness. Seems like that might be the size setting here. Like I said, they all are named something different. So that's pretty good. And let's go ahead. What do we want to set this to? I'm going to there we go. All right. I'm going to change the wood color to be a little bit brighter and a little bit darker because we can't see it that well. There we go. So that's your wood grain. Now you can see it's all kind of very herky-jerky there. Looks more like some sort of steampunk gear. There is a, what's it called in wood? It is not thickness, radial noise, is that it? One of them smooths that out. I forgot which one. Radial noise is adding noise the other way. How about axial noise? Yeah, the axial noise is the one that's kind of making those stripes weird. And radial noise. Let's dump that down too. And now they should be much straighter. So now it starts to look like wood. And my colors aren't very good here, so let's make this a little bit more like wood grain. There we go. Oops, that's awfully pink. There we go. So starts to look like wood. That's way too pink for my How about that? Much better. So now we've got a nice wood grain. If we want to add a bump map to that, we could go to bump. I'm just going to make a copy because I'm going to change the colors. I'm going to make one really bright and one really dark. And now, oh, too bumpy. Way too bumpy. There we go. Is that under noise? That's under bump, okay. I'm going to bump that up to about 80%. For some reason, by the way, bump is always set to 30%. If you're doing anything with your normal maps, you want to bump this. You want to bump the bump up to 100%, or else it won't show correctly. So let's see what that's doing with our light. And for some reason, my viewport here has completely given up on me. Let's redo that. There we go. So now, even though that looks really ugly, I don't like that wood grain at all, but it is bumpy. I don't like the way that looks. It's about the worst wood grain I've ever made. I'm going to take that off. So, there we go. Back to something different. It's probably because I didn't have a specular highlight on it. So. So the shaders, which we could play with forever. Now, my on-ground students, when I do this exercise, I usually give them a while to just play with them. I don't know any better way to learn the shaders other than just experimenting. And it's really a non-linear process to learn. I'm glad we don't really have to use shaders a whole lot with video games because it would be difficult to teach. There's whole careers that have to do with just shader development and the scripting that tends to go along with them. And that's because every one of these has a different interface. And you can combine them in not only unlimited ways, but they're not really like recipes. You can't just recreate them because they're so dependent on scale. And so if you had, say, a tree bark that you really liked, all the trees would have to be similar scales for it to work, or else when you dropped it on a tree that was, say, a smaller scale, which we deal with all the time. If you're making things for Unity, the scale's practically microscopic. If you're dealing with UDK, the scale's a little bit more real world. Those shaders wouldn't work if you were using them to bake out. Now, one last thing, the thing we started this video with. Your shaders are not going to export with your model. The maps will. And that can cause problems if you have a shader applied to the model and you export the model. The maps, the bitmaps, a lot of times are going to export with the model, which probably is what you want. But of course, if you're using shaders, it may not be what you want because maybe you just had that shader on there to see what it would look like or to make the model look good over in Max. And you can kind of screw up your exports. You could be exporting stuff you don't want. So your best bet is to bake out the shader on a separate copy of the model. Don't put any procedural shaders on the stuff that's going into a video game. Just bake that out as a map because all that's going into the game engine eventually is just going to be maps. You'll do your procedural shaders over in UDK or Unity, most likely. So that'll do it for today. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will see you all later. Bye-bye.